Great, thanks so much, Emily. And I want to apologize in advance. I have an unstable internet connection today, I'm assuming due to the weather. So Emily's just going to jump in and tell me when all of a sudden I go into freeze mode. But hopefully we will make it through the presentation. There's a lot for us to cover today, so we may not make it to the breakout sessions, but please don't worry, we'll tackle those on Monday if we don't get there today. So what are our goals here? So our learning objectives, obviously we want to understand the impact of foreign influence on the biomedical research. We need to recognize what is foreign component, the definition and purpose of other support, and the other key forms, which are the financial conflict of interest and commitments that are the required documents that we really want to be paying attention to, and to know how and where to document each of those. And so when we move along, we want to ask ourselves, what is foreign influence? Well, it's the concern that a security risk may exist, and that can happen between an individual and a foreign entity, and it undermines the principles to the integrity of the biomedical research enterprise. And this became very apparent when problems started to surface at the NIH. And Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, wrote a memo back in August of 2018, where he identified three key aspects of foreign influence that were creating great concern to the NIH. And the first was the failure by some researchers at NIH-funded institutions to disclose substantial contributions of resources. And those came from other organizations, including foreign governments. There was the diversion of IP in the grant application process. And in addition, there was the concern, that the sharing of confidential information during the peer review was being transmitted to foreign entities. And so as Emily is showing here, both Matt Lauer and actually bipartisan support from Congress and the Senate led to the NIH partnering with the FBI to investigate foreign influence at US institutions. As you can imagine, this put all of us on alert. And in preamble to that, what Matt Lauer did was they sent out a notice, and you see these all the time. It can be, for example, during COVID, we had notice on flexibilities, but this particular notice reminded everyone of the need to report foreign and domestic activities, especially those germane to sponsored projects. And we would do that through our careful documentation of other support, foreign components, and adherence to financial conflict of interest and commitment. And the purpose of this was really to prevent, as Emily was just describing in the other support document, any scientific, budgetary, or commitment overlap. And that would then, of course, ensure proper oversight of financial conflicts before and while NIH funds are being expended. And this leads to the top of the slide here, where Matt Lauer is addressing that there was a failure to report, that when you fail to report, that can lead to a distortion of funding decisions. And so one key, you can switch the slide now, will show you what was one big issue that they were noticing, and that was the 1,000 Talents program. So the Chinese Communist Party had announced as far back as 2008 that they were going to promote a program where they would try to engage high quality foreign professionals in what was called the 1,000 Talents program. And their goal was to achieve global technology supremacy. And as you can see, they have committed 15% of their GDP, the equivalent of $2.1 trillion in 2019, to this effort. That is a tremendous amount of money. And that too created the concerns that the NIH was wanting to address. Well, what is the 1,000 Talents program? Well, if we switch to the next slide, we'll see what it entails. For the researcher, they would receive from the Chinese government significant salary. They could get an appointment at a foreign university. There would be a funded shadow lab. In this particular case with the China Talents Program, the lab would be in China, and you would have access to high-tech equipment. What we were noting was that the Chinese government was reaching out to our Nobel laureates and requesting that they become part of the Talents Program. You can imagine this would be very alluring. They got millions upon millions of dollars, not only in their hand, but also through this high-tech equipment that was being offered via lab space in China. But what's the cost? So the cost is, in return, there was a commitment that the researcher keep the terms of this 1,000 Talents program confidential, therefore do not disclose to your university, do not disclose the results of the work that was conducted under Chinese patronage. You were to turn over any IP that you developed, whether it was conducted in the US or in China. You were required to ask permission of the Chinese government if you were to terminate this agreement. And you were to provide appointments in your US lab to Chinese collaborators or visitors. As you can imagine, on the next slide, this was unacceptable to the federal government. And so, as I've highlighted here, we see that the investigations by the FBI leading to what I want to clarify here, not every foreign influence is bad. Much of what we do is to incentivize global interaction. But there are situations where it crosses over the bounds and it does become what we call malign foreign influence. And so since 2020, as you can see here, scientists have resigned or they've actually been fired. And of the, since 2020, greater than 90% of those that were investigated had researchers who were tied to these 1,000 Talents program. So the NIH had sent out over 200 letters to more than, 70 US institutions to address these concerns and to really ask that we as research administrators and researchers pay attention to what our faculty are doing in foreign entities, whether it be a university or an agency. And so if we switch to the next slide, what we want to ask ourselves is, well, what is a foreign component? So a foreign component is the performance of any significant scientific element or segment of a project that is conducted outside the United States, either by the recipient or by the researcher employed by a foreign organization. And this is a key piece, whether or not grant funds are expended. So for foreign component, there are two criteria that must be met. The first, as I just stated, is that there is activity that is significant conducted outside the United States. So two things, it has to be outside the United States and it has to be considered significant. Well, this can be a little bit tricky. So when we think about significance, first we have to meet the geography bar. So we identify, let's say, for example, that the work is being done outside the United States. Now we need to evaluate the element of the project that's being conducted outside the United States within the context of the project as a whole in order to make a decision about significance. And so, for example, we have here, I've listed some ideas that could help you understand whether you have a foreign component. One would be if there is intention to collaborate with those foreign investigators and co-author papers. That's significant because it means that the research is significant. In addition, use of facilities or instrumentations at a foreign site, for example, a foreign lab. Extensive foreign travel. This helps us to determine whether the activity being done at those foreign sites is significant. And the receipt of financial support or resources from that foreign entity. And so in the next slide, where would we disclose foreign component? Well, it's actually pretty easy for foreign component. During the pre-award process, as we show here, many of us have PIs who are doing global research, and so they may have a subaward to a foreign entity, University of Bologna in Italy, for example. And in the NIH Assist application, it's going to ask you just that. Is there work on this project being done outside the United States? And you'll answer yes. And if then you answer yes, there obviously is going to be a budget, and there's going to then be the need for a foreign justification for that budget. And that is where we put that budget in the other attachments. We also, with our key personnel, are going to identify it in the biosketch. One key piece, as I just mentioned, is publications. Another place where you may see the need to identify a foreign component is if there is a paid or unpaid appointment at a foreign institution, and that you would list under the honors and positions. There is an opportunity where you might need to mention it during JIT. For example, let's say that your PI has a very close collaborator at Duke, and that collaborator gets a recruitment package to go and work at the University of Bologna. And they up and leave Duke and they move to the University of Bologna in Italy. Now, you didn't know that at the time that you submitted the proposal, but you know it now during JIT. You're going to want to disclose that in JIT, because obviously by submitting that subaward proposal as part of the proposal, you know that their activity is going to be significant for your project. You want to keep that collaborator, even though they've moved from Duke to the University of Bologna. So you're going to mention that in JIT. Now, what happens if you don't know until after JIT? What happens if you find out during post-award, you've received the notice of award, and you know that your collaborator has moved out of the country? You need to seek prior approval from the NIH before any work commences. That is key. And then, of course, like all issues where you have global interaction, you would be disclosing that information yearly in your RPPR. So moving to the next slide, in addition to foreign component, we have the NIH other support. As we all know, by definition, in NIH other support, we are to include all financial resources, federal, non-federal, commercial, institutional, that's available in direct support of an individual's research endeavors. And this is included, but not limited to, the research grants, cooperative agreements, contracts, we've seen those, institutional awards. Those should all be reported in your other support. Remember, of course, we're not counting training, grants. You don't include that in your other support. Prizes, sometimes folks, faculty do get prizes, whether they're international or internal. And we're not including gifts at this time. But we want to remember, when we think about other support, why are we talking about this? Because Francis Collins and Mike Lauer made it very, very clear back in the summer of 2018 that what they were requesting, what the NIH requests in that other support document, it has not changed. But here's what's changed. Now the NIH is holding faculty and institutions accountable. So for us as research administrators, we need to remember that. And when we prepare those other support documents, we need to include resources and other financial support, be it lab personnel, or it could be provisions of perhaps a high value material like a biologic or a chemical that you're getting from a foreign entity. You need to be disclosing that in the other support because it's significant to your research. All current projects and activities for senior and key personnel, including in-kind, as I've described. What is in-kind resource? That would be an office perhaps at a foreign institution, lab space, equipment, supplies, even staff. And this is a tricky one, even staff are considered as a foreign resource and need to be identified in your other support document. And you would simply create, after you list out your typical other support documentation, a line, as Emily described, that just says domestic and foreign resources, and that's where you would put this information. And I want to mention that on the RMG website, they have some great examples of how you might do that. So in moving to our class exercise on the next slide, here is our question. I am a key personnel on an NIH grant in the US, and I am collaborating with another scientist in the US whose experiments have directly benefited my research. My collaborators' experiments were conducted with funds awarded to their institution. My question to you is, should this be reported on other support? And if you could just go ahead and put your answer into the chat. Good. I'm seeing lots of good answers. Excellent. Okay, so in the interest of time, let's think about this. So why would we report this on the other support? Well, as I just mentioned, on other support, you need to include both domestic and foreign research collaborations that directly benefit the research. And so in this case, we were very clear when we stated that they benefited the research. You need to be identifying that in other support. So great job. All right, let's move on to our next exercise. Super. I am PI on an NIH award at a foreign university and have an unpaid appointment at that foreign university. At the foreign site, I have access to lab space, research materials, and staff. My questions to you are, 1, is this a foreign component? Yes or no? Should this be reported as other support? Yes or no? And where would you list the unpaid appointments? And you can put your responses into the chat. Lot to think about here. Okay, so things to think about. Is this a foreign component? We've made it very clear. Obviously, it's a foreign component. The award is at a foreign university. Should this be reported as other support? Well, the PI is clearly telling you that they have access to lab space, research materials, staff, and those are considered foreign resources. And where would you list the unpaid appointment? Now, the unpaid appointment is going to be listed in the biosketch. In the biosketch under honors and positions is where you are going to be disclosing that your PI has an unpaid appointment at that foreign university. Okay, all right, so moving on. What are some other considerations and documents that we need to be mindful of? That is the conflict of commitment and the conflict of interest. And these are a little bit tricky. We don't typically work with these documents. And what we need to be mindful of as research administrators is to make sure that our PIs are keeping these forms up to date. And so when we think about a conflict of commitment, here we've identified it as university community members who are Stanford faculty and staff. We owe our primary professional allegiance to the university and its mission to engage in the highest level of education, research, healthcare, and business practices. And think back to that 1,000 Talents program. There's a split of allegiance when you assume I'll call it a membership into that 1,000 Talents program. because you are splitting your professional allegiance to your university. This is something that needs to be disclosed. In addition, in order to protect our primary mission, members with other professional or financial interests shall disclose them in compliance with applicable conflict of commitment and interest policies, and if permitted, manage them in compliance with all controls put in place. And Stanford actually has a specific conflict of commitment and interest review panel, and it's led by Barbara Flynn. So if you want to, you can certainly Google her, or you can look into Stanford Who, and you can identify Barbara Flynn and her office and look into that a little bit more. But the other place where you can be helping your faculty is through OPACs. And when they go into SARA and they are completing their side of the PDRF, they will be asked OPACs questions. So what might be something to consider? When we look at the financial conflict of interest, the situation in which an individual or the individual's spouse or dependent children has a financial interest or financial relationship that could directly or significantly affect the design, content, reporting, and finding of the research. And we have to remember that our investigators must report these conflicts of interest to our institution. And as I mentioned, we checked through that with Barbara Flynn. What might be some other types of conflict of interest? If we look on the next slide, we also have to be thinking about travel. Now, this is something that actually is often overlooked. We have faculty who many times are paid by that foreign entity to travel there. And what Stanford is wanting us to remember is that there is significant travel by some of these faculty, and we need to be paying attention to that. So investigators on PHS-funded research must disclose occurrences of reimbursed or sponsored travel that are related to the institutional responsibilities at Stanford, regardless of the relationship of the travel to PHS funding. And when they put a de minimis threshold on that, and it is within a 12-month period of time, if your faculty member exceeds $5,000 in travel, they need to disclose that to Barbara Flynn's office. And again, it comes through in OPACs. So your job as a research administrator is just to be able to know about the financial conflicts of commitment and interest, and to be able to point your faculty in the right direction. And then finally, when we think about conflict of commitment, what is that? It has to do with time and effort. So for example, as they describe it here, it's a situation in which an individual accepts or incurs conflicting obligations. And we see that when we have a faculty member who perhaps decides to take an appointment at another university, and there is a conflict of time with how they are spending their time at that university. We've got it listed here as it can include obligations that share information. That also is considered a conflict of commitment. And it can also be time, because both of those threaten the research security and integrity. And they really bring into question of that faculty member. So on the next slide, let's look at some examples to help us understand what is a conflict of commitment. This has been reported to the NIH. These are NIH examples. A US researcher had an undisclosed appointment of employment in another country for 9 months out of the year, yet was paid by his university for all 12 months. You can see right there, egregious conflict of commitment. And second, US funded researcher, party to an undisclosed contract with a foreign institution for $1.2 million in startup research funds, and obligated to file 2 to 3 foreign patents with that foreign institution in the subsequent 3 years of that appointment. This person did not disclose this information to the home institution. And this is an example of issues related to the Thousand Talents program. And so let's look at the extent of the problem on the next slide. Since 2000, or as of 2020, almost 400 NIH researchers have been identified. And of them, 70% failed to disclose receipt of a foreign grant. 54% failed to disclose participation in a foreign talents recruitment program. 9% hid ties to a foreign company, and 5% were involved in a violation of the peer review system, which honestly, the numbers, we can say the 70%, the 54, the 9, it's the 5%. That last one, guys, is just the absolute undermining of our federal institution for research support. If you are taking peer-reviewed information, and whether you're selling it to another government entity or simply taking that, that is proprietary information. That is your faculty members' hard work that is now being taken during peer review and given to another collaborator to use to support their own research endeavors. That's just simple. And this is why Mike Lauer is so up in arms about this issue of foreign influence. So almost 200 NIH funded researchers and 87 institutions have been sanctioned, either by the NIH or their own employer, and 77 have been blocked from ever applying for a new NIH grant. That is how seriously we all need to take this. And so when we look in summary, let's think about foreign influence through 3 lenses: foreign component, other support, and the conflict of interest and commitment statements. It's our obligation as researchers, we need to disclose any foreign component that contributes significantly to the research, and we need to abide by the principles of open transparency. Remember, our faculty, our PIs, when they assume the funding from the NIH, those are your taxpayer dollars, and they pledged to open that research to the public. It is required that it be in the public domain. That is the issue around the PMCIDs. This all goes back to open transparency. It does secure the health of the biomedical research enterprise. As we learned this morning in the medical grand rounds, how important it is to be transparent with our research, our data. Full disclosure of resources assists with the determination that the NIH can make to help support how we fund our researchers. And then finally, we need to inform our own institution of any conflict of interest or commitment prior to applying for the NIH funding. And so